Please welcome to the stage Andrew Davies, CMO at Paddle, and Vivian Shao, pricing consultant at Paddle.
Hey, how are we doing? Good to see everyone. Third day, a few hours left. My name's Andrew, this is Vivian. We are going to dive into 10 short, quick minutes of content. We would love to go as deep as possible at the booth after this. We've got loads of data we'd love to dig through. We're going to talk about some of the current benchmarks on growth in the industry and how pricing can accelerate that. So I'll do a bit of hand waving up front, and then Vivian will dive into some data-backed. Okay, cool. So what's going on in the current market? Paddle sees behind about 36 billion of ARR for our metrics product. So we see a really interesting portion of the SaaS market. For context, we deal with international payments, tax compliance for about 4,000 software companies, but we also have about 20,000 that use our free product. And this is how we get this huge data set that we're able to look through. So across the last few years, we can see the macro happen in real time through our data. We can segment this in lots of different ways. We publish it on our website every month if you want to dive into detail. And you can see here over the last few years a few things that happened. And there's definitely a virus we're not allowed to name, otherwise it hits our YouTube rankings. That's what we were told. You get blocked. Anyway, so what's going on? Well, right now, growth has stabilized. So if we flick to the next slide, you can see very clearly that there's an impact on these interest rates and then our growth rates. You know, we've talked about this lots. We don't want to labor the point, but in our data, you can see when the rates dropped, very significant growth happened, and then when the rates rose, growth stabilized. And if we pop to the next slide, what we mean here, and we're imposing here, 2024 on 2022, you can see that growth is lower, but it's more stable. So there's wins and there's losses. There's good things and there's bad things. We're definitely growing slower than we saw before, but it's more stable. So in this context, what can we do about it? Well, we've only got a few short minutes here today, and we'd love to dive into any of these topics you want to discuss. There's big and scary topics like, where do you sit with your narrative and your story? How does that sit within an ever more competitive market? Your ideal customer, how narrow can you get to go and win those next few? AI and the impact it has. Or we could get really specific. We could dive into pricing mechanics. We could think about localization, something that we deeply care about as we help thousands of software companies localize around the world. We could dive into specific tactics to inflect your NRR upwards. But for the next few minutes, what we're going to do instead is deal with pricing, because it's one of those things that's big and complicated. And with us today, we've got someone from our Price Intelligently team that are a team of consultants who have helped companies like ADP, companies like Intercom, companies like Adobe. And they've seen behind more pricing studies than anyone else in the SaaS market. Now, we've got loads of data we could show, but given time, we'll do that at our booth afterwards. If you want a live pricing page teardown of your pricing, we'd love to do that too. We'll put Vivian on the spot. But for now, why don't Vivian, you give us just a few key top-level recommendations?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. So the first piece I'm going to talk about today is working on expansion revenue. As many of you know, it's much easier to grow your existing customer base than it is to grow a new customer in a low-growth environment. So there are two ways to do this. The first is through price increases. And while this may be something that is pretty intuitive to most folks, what we believe in is value-based pricing. And so what that looks like is going out to the market, going out to prospects and your current customers to understand what people are actually willing to pay for your product. Of course, the competitive landscape is really important in this, so making sure to layer in a competitive element so that you're pricing in line with what the market expects to pay is going to be important there as well. The second piece, however, I'm going to focus on a little bit more here, and this is creating good feature differentiation to promote upgrades and upsell opportunities. And so by understanding what functionalities to your product your customers consider to be core, value-driving, or more niche, and layering that on top of features that people are willing to pay more for, you're able to create thoughtful differentiators between your packages that are tailored towards different ICPs or different stages of your customers. The next piece I'll talk about is revisiting your pricing structure and your value metrics. So what is a value metric? So this is essentially the metric that you're charging your customers by for using your product. And a good example of this is users or seats. So this is pretty much what every SaaS defaults to early on. The reason being is that it's easy to understand and it's very familiar to the market. However, in our experience, it's not necessarily the best lever of monetizing your product, especially when you're starting to think about apps or websites that focus on automation or process improvements, in theory, the better your product works, the less users you'll eventually need. And so what we look to do here is implement some level of usage-based pricing that grows with your product. A strong value metric has three things. The first is that it's simple to understand. Your customers should be pretty easily able to figure out which package is best suited for them, and you should be able to easily measure and implement that growth. The next is that it's aligned to the value that your customer gets out of your product. And lastly, it should grow and scale with both the size of the companies that work with you and the usage that they're getting out of your tool. And the last piece I'm going to talk about here is localization. As Andrew mentioned, growth has slowed in a lot of regions, including here in the US. However, there are some regions like Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, and Southern Europe that has seen a little bit more growth than we have here locally. And so expanding into those areas is a really good way to capture additional opportunity. There's two ways to do this. The first is through cosmetic localization. And that's something as simple as changing the currencies, the language on your website to make sure that buyers in those regions can pay and understand what they're purchasing. And doing this alone can contribute to about 30% growth from what we've seen. But the next piece that I'm going to talk about is true market localization. And this involves going out and doing research and understanding the willingness to pay of buyers in different regions. This is really important because the dollar goes a different amount of ways in different areas. And so understanding what willingness to pay looks like and what the competition looks like in different regions is going to help you stay competitive as you look to expand your product and your services into other regions. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Andrew to talk about our key takeaways here.
Cool. So some top-level summaries here. The first thing is we have said that growth has slowed, but none of us in the room want to settle for less. Maybe we'd have a raise of hands for everyone who wants to settle for less. None of us want to settle for less. You know, the average age of someone wearing diapers in the US is 22. The average is not so helpful, right? There's a bunch of young people and a few very old people. So when we talk about this average growth rate, that's not what we should be focused on, because actually we see a really bifurcated story. There's people who are adopting these strategies and growing really fast, and there's people who aren't, and for a bunch of reasons are pretty flatlining. And so don't settle for slow and steady. Aspire to make sure you can be one of those who are growing at significantly above clip. That's the first thing. It's a mindset. And there's lots of bad news out there. Let's make sure our mindset is set on things are possible. Second one, build this pricing muscle now. We see in our data that if you just simply make pricing experiments, pricing changes, then you outperform on a revenue and a growth perspective than if you don't at all. So actually our data shows if you change your prices once every 3 months, you'll outperform a company that doesn't change their prices over a 3-year period by 103% of your average revenue per user or your average revenue per account. So it's not even whether it's a good price change. It's just something you're doing to build the muscle. So set a meeting in your diary to discuss how you can challenge yourself to change pricing. Build that pricing muscle now. And then finally, chase international growth. Vivian's spoken about this. We see areas around the world which are still seeing solid growth. And you'll have heard many talks across SaaSta this year, last year, about sales-led and product-led, about blending these models. And one of the beauties about a product-led model is it's born global. You can serve the entire world very, very quickly from that product-led motion. And so we love working with companies who have that blended motion and they're able to serve the entire world. Because actually you build resilience into your business model, because even when there's slow growth in your home territory, you're able to chase higher growth around the world. Anyway, we'll stop there. There's loads of content throughout today, so you don't want to hear us anymore. But if you'd like to dive into loads of detail on any of this, the data that sits behind it, we'd love to show you it. If you want to get a live pricing page teardown from Vivian, please come and do that. And of course, if you want some nice swag, come to our booth next door and have a great final day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.